And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds unfold. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
Welcome, everyone, to the first ever Nostalgia podcast. Nostalgia spelt with a G, a silent G, obviously. So what is that? That's Gnosis. I think this is where the idea came from. Gnosis combined with the word nostalgia, nostalgia itself being a weird sort of amalgam of the Homeric word nostos, meaning homecoming, and algos, meaning sorrow. So it's actually a concoction of ancient Hellenic idioms and Latin rule bending, coined at the beginning of the 18th century in the age of Romanticism. So all of that should be in some way indicative of the kind of spirit of this podcast. Combine that with gnosis, the search for knowledge that's not simply episteme or rationalistically arrived at knowledge, but the kind of knowledge that it is unveiled tacitly in the great mystery of the cosmos to which we're subject. And for all of that, I'm joined, so here I am, Sebastian Morello, joined by Brian Scarffe, my strange, esoteric, wine-dealing friend. So do introduce yourself.
I mean, it's very delightful to have been roped into this. I'm looking forward to exploring untouched horizons of Christian philosophy and other forbidden areas of podcasting.
Well, I'll just begin by saying that this is an obsession of particularly Brian's, and he's kind of placed the spell on me. And he got me to read this book, which I have here on my shelf, by Hugh Ross Williamson, written at the beginning of the last century, I think, called The Flowering Hawthorne. In which this Anglican cleric, who later became a Catholic priest, collects the evidence to suggest that the church in England was originally established in the 1st century by Joseph of Arimathea, the man who owned the tomb in which Christ's body was placed after the crucifixion. And Williamson even goes so far as to suggest that Joseph of Arimathea, whom tradition says was a tin merchant who owned tin mines in the West Country of England, that he came here on a number of occasions, perhaps bringing with him the adolescent Jesus Christ, which of course is the basis for the tradition that gave William Blake the lyrics and did those feet in ancient times, etc., etc. So that's where all of this comes from. Brian, do you want to say a little bit about Arimathean spirituality?
Well, I think that the mystery surrounding what happened in the 1st century can't be expressed more clearly or in more tantalizing terms than St. Augustine of Canterbury when he writes to Pope Gregory, essentially saying that there's a certain royal island called in the ancient speech Glastonia, dedicated to the most sacred deity. And in it, the earliest English neophytes of the Catholic faith, God guiding them, founded a church, or found a church, not built by the art of man, they say, but prepared by God himself for the salvation of mankind, which church the heavenly builder himself declared, by many miracles and many mysteries of healing, he had consecrated to himself and to the Holy Mary, Mother of God. There's even an iteration of that passage which says that the church was constructed not by human art but by the hands of Christ himself, and so this has been spiritualized and allegorized away, but reads as a profoundly mysterious indication that those feet may well have in ancient times journeyed to our island, and it's not some late medieval or early modern fantasy.
I mean, it's certainly I think it's undeniable that Christianity was here before Augustine of Canterbury arrived. That there was an ancient Romano-British church, that we have found excavated the homes of aristocratic Romano-British families with these glorious mosaics of Christ or the Blessed Virgin on the floors of these homes that had their own chapels, and that the centre of that ancient Romano-British church was a monastic settlement at Glastonbury. I think that is widely accepted. I don't think that's sort of phony history.
Well, I would want to step back just 1 second and suggest that the whole story of English Christianity is so tied up in mythological and legendary oral tradition that it should give us pause as to why God incarnate would be born into history and become a real historical person, and at the same time God made the historical process itself one in which any historical event immediately begins to fade the instant it's occurred towards a horizon which we are always further and further from, and becomes less and less easy to see with the kind of reductionistic and materialistic clarity that we like to think of in our modern historical or journalistic terms, and instead, as it travels towards the historical horizon, becomes wrapped up in what at the time would have perhaps seemed unrelated and mythological ideas. It seems that the very nature of history itself requires historical precision to fall by the wayside. And this is some aspect of the early founding of Christianity in this country, but I think it's true of everywhere. It's just very clear in the English sphere that very early on the Grail mysteries get wrapped in, the Arthurian romances emerge much later than Arthur lives, but they all become a single body of thought in some sense that can't really be disentangled to find a pure historical event. And I think there's something very important about the meaning of time and history in that.
Yeah. So, but I think we need to drill down a little bit into this, because I think we're assuming a lot of knowledge on the part of our listeners here. So, what Hugh Ross Williamson, at least, which is really the only work I have to work with here on this topic. What he at least claims is that there's Joseph of Arimathea. He is, Williamson argues, clearly a relation of Jesus Christ, because he would not have been able to have the special privilege to take the body of Christ, Christ having been executed as a criminal. He would not have received this special privilege to take the body and place him into the tomb, had he not been a direct family relation. So, as I understand it, he is the uncle that is the paternal. No,
the great uncle. So the uncle of the Virgin Mary.
So he's
That's Eastern tradition. Yeah.
Joachim's brother. Is that right? Would that make him? Yeah, Joachim's brother.
Yes.
So okay, fine. And one of the arguments that Williamson gives is that when Jesus and Joseph and Mary are travelling back from their pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, and they lose Jesus for 3 days when he's 12 years old. That's in the New Testament. And the question is, are they just really lousy parents? Or did they think that he was with another family member at that time? And Williamson notes that the first stop leaving Jerusalem is in Arimathea. So again, the idea is that he was staying with his great uncle, and then word got around that actually he wasn't with him, and they're starting to wonder where he was, and that's why they go back to the temple and they find him there teaching among the teachers in the temple. And then there's this strange thing with this flowering hawthorn, where in Glastonbury there was this famous flowering hawthorn. Cuttings of it were given to the kings and queens of England as gifts, but they were also taken to the continent and given as gifts to other monarchs. And this hawthorn was considered to be very special because it flowered twice. It would flower when all the other hawthorns flowered, but it would also flower at Christmas time. And
it was a Middle Eastern variety of hawthorn as well.
But that was only discovered, I think, in the 19th century, when around the town of Arimathea in the 19th century were found these double flowering hawthorns. So again, very, very mysterious. And all of this great kind of quasi-mythological, or let's just say the ancient Christian mythos of these isles, there was a great effort to sort of destroy all of this from the English consciousness in the rise of Puritanism. And Cromwell went around burning not just the holy hawthorn of Glastonbury, but all of the little saplings that have been taken and planted elsewhere in the country. He tried to find them all and burn them. And I'm told that there is actually one, because a few of them survived, and there is actually one just outside, would you believe it, Milton Keynes, and several people have gone and found it. But anyway.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I've heard from a very sober, reputable source that there are very mysterious happenings surrounding even modern engagement with this hawthorn. So I read in a book by a sober historian on Glastonbury Abbey that he had a personal close friend who visited, this must have been in the 1940s or 50s, visited Glastonbury and didn't believe in any of the myths, didn't believe in any of the sort of mysticism surrounding Glastonbury at all. I don't know if they were even a religious believer, maybe in the very loose Anglican sense. And she cut herself some clippings from the Hawthorne and wrapped it up very carefully, took it back to her hotel room and packed it in her backpack. And when she returned back to her home, she unpacked everything, and the cloth within which everything had been carefully packed was still exactly as she had originally packaged it. And she opened it up, and all the clippings were gone. There was nothing left, not even the faintest trace. And this skeptical, sober person was convinced that something very mysterious had happened, and that she had transgressed some sacred borderline around this Hawthorne without realizing it. That's what she came to believe. So this is miraculous occurrences even into the modern day among skeptics.
Yeah. Now, Glastonbury, I'm told, I've never been to Glastonbury. I hear that it is my kind of place, and it's very strange, and it's believed that there are a number of ley lines of important, essentially cosmic energies that actually converge and cross over one another at exactly the place of Glastonbury. And there are a number of important thinkers. Obviously, you know that Jean Hany, the great French philosopher, has made a big impression on me over the years, who argue that all of the great cathedrals, all the really great holy shrines, are built on places of important ley line convergence. And Glastonbury and Glastonbury Abbey seems to have been one of them.
I believe that Glastonbury was one of the great centres of the Druidic goddess cult, which Chartres is perhaps more famous for. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that this unveils importance behind the old wattle church being consecrated to Saint Mary, Our Lady of Glastonbury, by Saint Joseph of Arimathea himself.
Was Our Lady of Glastonbury a Black Madonna?
No, so that is interesting. I wondered the same thing myself. I actually don't know. The legend says that Saint Joseph himself made the first image of Our Lady, and that it survived the Great Fire at the turn of the millennium. I don't know if it is known whether it made it to the Reformation. My guess is if it survived the fire, it must have. And at this point, I'm not sure. I haven't come across any information as to whether it was destroyed or whether some pious family may have squirreled it away. If it did make it to the Reformation, we're talking about an image that had lasted nearly 1,500 years. I don't know whether it was. It may have been made in stone. I'm trying to remember where I read on this. But I've not heard that it was a Black Madonna per se. That being said, the philosophical mysteries of the Black Madonnas seem very appropriately laid at the feet of Our Lady of Glastonbury. As much as it's true of Chartres, it must be true of Glastonbury. Those two centres seem to be twinned in the ancient world as the two great Druidic locations.
And the Druidic dimension to this is important because it seems that the Druids of the old, what became England under the Anglo-Saxons, but was then a kind of strange hybrid people of settled Roman military families and local kind of Wodish tribes throughout England, and who form this race of the Romano-British. And there are still these connections with these Druidic orders, and these Druidic orders are essentially they're not what is commonly believed today. People think that they are the sort of antecedents of, New Age Wicca that was a kind of invention of Gerald Gardner in the 1920s, and really has no connection with ancient Druidic religion in any way, because what the Druids really were a Celtic Pythagorean order, and Pythagoreanism and what became Neoplatonic philosophy was essentially the shared religious vernacular of the entire Western world at that time, and gave it the idiom with which to dialogue with other religious traditions like those of Persia and India and so on. And this Pythagoreanism also seems to have been the fundamental mode by which Jesus Christ and his family approached scriptural interpretation, because even someone as important an exegete as Joseph Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, argue that that Joseph and Mary and Jesus belonged to the Essenes. Now, of course, there were these three main competing schools of scriptural interpretation during that period at the time of Christ's life, and those were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And the Essenes are, of course, never discussed in the New Testament, because it seems, at least this is Ratzinger's view, the entire New Testament is read from the perspective of the Essenes, from the perspective of Pythagorean Jews or Neoplatonic Jews, Hellenized Jews.
It would give important explanatory power to why the Gospels seem to have such mature philosophical threads, an aspect of them which has led many scholars to date them much later than the first century, because it seems that how could unlearned fishermen write books that have numerological and mystery cult type thinking baked into the narrative? And so if as has been suggested, during the early period of the early church, the disciples they can't go to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were the ones that killed Christ, and the Sadducees are similarly not positively disposed to the emergence of the new movement.
Well, also, just to say, the fundamental argument of this new movement is that they are following a risen Messiah, and the entire identity of the Sadducees at that time is based on a denial of the resurrection. So that's certainly not going to work.
And furthermore, the Essenes were waiting for a teacher of righteousness. Their whole eschatology was waiting for something like a deeply mystical Messiah. It wasn't material like the Zealots. They weren't expecting the Romans to be overthrown by might and power of the sword. They were expecting something far more eschatological.
Which is really a really important point, because just as a side note, this is an error I see at the moment, that we fundamentally believe that exoteric transformation is a consequence of esoteric transformation. Now, maybe in time they happen simultaneously, but one is logically prior to the other, even not to deny their correlated principles. That is to say that the transformation of the world comes about by the transformation of the spirit. And what we hear a lot today, particularly by our more integralist friends, for example, is that as long as you have a political strongman, you can bring about the transformation of the spirit. And that's not how these things work, right? That there is so much debate at the moment of trying to attain something like a Christendom model of a Western social order without something as elementary as holiness or the reception of grace. And what I think you're saying here is that the Essenes, rather than looking for a political revolutionary, they were looking for a transformation of the spirit, what Steiner would call a transformation of consciousness, but essentially a transformation of the spirit, an outpouring of grace, which may have all kinds of practical political consequences, but it is the fundamental prerequisite. Sorry to interrupt you there.
No, not at all. I was only leading to the point that the Essenes were the one group who were so disenfranchised from the Jewish life of the temple at the time that they would be willing to give a hearing to something as interesting as the idea that the Logos had become incarnate, and that they had the philosophical sophistication to start opening up what that might look like. In fact, if the Essenes were Pythagoreans and they were to embrace a group of men who'd experienced what the New Testament apostles experienced, you would expect something like the Gospel of John to emerge.
Yes, exactly.
Filled with numerology and number symbolism and visionary connections that go beyond what you would expect any one individual to have the insights for. And this allows for the inspiration of the Spirit, but the Spirit works through, has been working for hundreds of years to prepare all of the right context for this food to be properly digested. And perhaps its absolute pinnacle is the Book of Revelation. So the Book of Revelation is so deeply numerological and Pythagorean. And perhaps my favourite contemporary explorer of these mysteries, Jean-Michel, wrote a book called The Dimensions of Paradise, yes, where he shows that the numbers which are given for the New Jerusalem are not simply arbitrary in the sense that they had some powerful symbolic meaning to the Jews, but it could have been any set of numbers with those symbols. That this was actually, that the dimensions are actually the fundamentally Pythagorean numbers that reflect the very ratios at the heart of the solar system itself. The relationship between the sun and the earth and the moon are encoded in Pythagorean numerology and just happen to be built into the scales and measurements of the New Jerusalem. And this isn't just that requires profound learning in the wisdom traditions.
And this isn't just like a couple of this isn't just wacky stuff. I mean, the very important and highly rated French philosopher Simone Weil, I know she died very young, but she was extremely prolific. And as you pointed out to me, she was making these arguments in her study of her comparative work of Christianity and Greek philosophy. So this is already out there in some authoritative texts, certainly.
Yes, in some ways, I think her thinking is quite an embarrassment to people who like to take her seriously, because it requires not only to take the ancient mystery traditions like Pythagoreanism in a more serious light, but even more so the New Testament. All of a sudden, these ancient ways of thinking, which modern philosophers like to feel that they've transcended with their Hegels and their Nietzsches, begin to seem far less substantive against a multi-millennia long meditation on the theology of numbers and the relationships between cosmic bodies and forces, which we still can't explain exactly how the people came into knowledge of.
Well, I think they came into knowledge of it by an examination of the universe as iconographic of the Godhead. They studied the universe, they had a cosmology, and they saw it to be the unfolding communication of God, which is the kind of Neoplatonic view of the world. And of course, this cosmology became the Christian cosmology, and it's you brought up John Michel. This is how we end up with Christian architecture in the West. This is how we end up with these Gothic forms, which of course get particularly consolidated under Abbot Sugur of Saint Denis in Paris, who becomes the great kind of foundation layer for what becomes High Gothic in the medieval period. But all of Christian architecture is trying to take the cosmic principles down, incarnate them in stone and glass, and then offer the cosmos back up to God as a kind of oblation. So, and that's when you realise that, and you look at modern architecture, that is a kind of round lump of concrete that operates as a meeting hall for people to kind of enter into a pseudo-liturgical self-affirmation session. You realise that actually the church is growing because of its acceptance of the assumptions and prejudices of modernity. The church is growing so rapidly alien to herself that we're having to discover all of this stuff as if for the first time, as if this isn't actually part of our spiritual inheritance, all the stuff that we're talking about. Now, the big question is, and I've been thinking a lot about this recently, why does any of this actually matter? Why does it matter that we at this stage in history try to anxiously recover an idea of the Christian mythos, that we spend time thinking about whether Christ as an adolescent came and walked the hills of the West Country with his great uncle and went into the ancient tin mines that were producing tin to be transported across Europe all the way to Palestine through the structures and trade canals of the Roman Empire. That Joseph of Arimathea returned to England after the ascension of Christ and evangelized the tribes of this country. That he established a church at Glastonbury. That when I can't remember which medieval king it was, decided that he would add to Glastonbury Abbey and make it a much more impressive and glorious structure, and he had to open up the foundations in order to reinforce them for a larger structure. He found two tombs that had the Latin names of Arthur and Guinevere on them. In Arthur's tomb he found a great sword, which eventually was given by Richard the Lionheart as a gift to the King of Sicily for safe passage to the Third Crusade. That there is this mystical mythos to these islands that were touched by the personal presence of the incarnate God. The man who gave to the incarnate God a tomb then came and consecrated this land. that the once and future king was interred in that very place. Why does any of this matter? And my answer, and I'll be interested to hear your view, my answer to that is that it's not just the church used in the broader sense, the community of the baptized. It's not just the church that's growing ever more alien to its own mystery. It's also it's the English. You know, it's a strange thing, because I don't think of the English first and foremost as an ethnic group. I certainly feel very English, even though I'm married to an immigrant. My grandfather was Polish. My surname is Mediterranean. I know that you are married to a wonderful young lady from Asia. That you are at least partly Belarusian, and yet. When you reside in this country and you're raised in this country and you're inducted into the mythos of this country, and you can feel it, you can see it in the hedgerows, on the hills, in the landscape, that there is something about England that is magical, and that the English are losing sight of this. And one of the terrible things about English modern history is that we were so terrified that to be English might be understood purely as an ethnic identity, that we championed this idea of multiculturalism, whereas actually the very thing to overcome the problem of identifying a people purely on ethnic grounds is to induct new arrivals into the culture, into the mythos of a particular place, which is something we failed to do. And as we have continually failed to do that, more and more people are entering a spiritual sightlessness about what England really is. And it seems to me that's why it's so important to recover the idea. If we really believe as Christians that nations are not simply random peoples collected together within geographical territories, but nations are corporate persons called to discipleship, which is what Matthew 28 says, right? Matthew 28 says, make disciples of the nations. And in the book of Revelation that you were just talking about, it's not individual atomized people who have said that Jesus is their Lord and Saviour who gather around the Lamb at the mystical wedding feast. It's the nations that gather around the Lamb. That we have to understand the nations as corporate persons called into mystical transformation. And in order to understand how each corporate person, each national person is called to mystical transformation, we have to understand what kind of person we're dealing with. And that's why I think this is the time to enter very, very deeply into the mystical mythos of this sceptred isle. Anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on all of that. But...
Well, I would agree, and I'd put it maybe more provocatively, that being English is being a member of a mystery cult. That is what it is to be English. You are inducted into a set of secret behaviours, secret rituals, including going to the pub and going hunting on the one hand, or more profoundly initiatory mysteries such as the English religion, the particular manifestation of the universal faith in English form, baptism, and all of the accompanying sacraments, the Eucharist, etc. And so to be English is also to be inducted into the legendarium, which comes along with that as well. The stories that contain the secrets the Arthurian romances, the mysteries of the Grail, everything's that emerges from the folklore, and particularly the folklore that has been properly elevated, infused with the Christian vitality, and that reorients the truths that it contains. And so all of these sort of mysteries and secrets that we're talking about, especially of the early ages, are a necessary part of a functioning mystery cult. So to revive them is to revive the cult itself.
Well, this is what you're describing is how I think of Christianity. Christianity, it seems to me, is a mystery religion. The early Christians understood this. The early Christians would go deep underground into the tombs of the martyrs, and they would carry out their liturgies, and they would chant the psalms, and they would offer the sacrifice of the Holy Eucharist, and they would enter the deep sleep states to be found in the practice of spiritual incubation. They would wander in the dream world. Wandering in the dream world in order to meet the gods, meet the angels and the saints, is on every page of scripture. Wandering in the dream world happens constantly. It happens to Saint Joseph. It happens to Saint Peter. It happens to the patriarchs in the Old Testament. Wandering in the dream world through deep transformations of consciousness through incubation is something that is just part of biblical spirituality. But we've lost this whole idea that to be Christian is to enter very, very, very deeply into transformative mysteries. And in the early church, the offering of the sacred sacrifice through the Eucharist was considered so sacrosanct that if you were not baptized, if you were a catechumen, you could stay to hear the scriptures being read, but then you were ushered out of the church. You would have to go and stand in what was called the narthex on the outside of the church. So, because only the baptized, only those who have been inducted into the sacred mysteries could be present at the holy sacrifice. This idea of Christianity as a mystery religion has disappeared from the Christian consciousness, and each discipled corporate national person has its own way of living that mystery religion, and that's why it's one of the great tragedies of Christian history of these isles that we lost our distinctive rites, like rites as in rites, like the Sarum rite and the York rite, for example. These ancient rites that were unique to this country that, first the Reformation chucked out, and then when the Roman Catholic hierarchy was re-established in this country, they declined to re-establish these rites, and thereby they robbed the faithful of their own liturgical inheritance in these isles. And these were massive, massive mistakes to make, because again, it has distanced the English people from their own mystery religion inheritance. That, I think, Brian, is the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is to reawaken in the English mind what it is to be part of the great mythos and cultus of these isles. I'll shut up now.
No, I completely agree with you. And so I'm provoked to now consider what we are talking about is the relationship between the universal and the particular. So you've got the universal religion, and then what is it about this land that makes it particular? And if you use the analogy of seed and soil, the seed is sown by the universal faith, and the soil is the dark, receptive, mothering element which receives it. It must be the aspect or prism of the divine feminine in a particular land, such as ours, which is the soil that the seed will grow in and take a unique set of characteristics from. Which is why I think that the question of the divine feminine, of divine wisdom, of the Marian mysteries, of the great Earth Mother, all of these questions are extremely relevant to that relationship of particular and universal, because the soil is that feminine receptivity.
Yes. Yes.
And at the heart of that in this country is Glastonbury.
Interesting. Well, certainly, it is a foundational Neoplatonic precept that whilst the universal exists, the universal can only be known in the particular. Just as it is, the first precept of the Emerald Tablet, the great Hermetic text translated by Saint Albert the Great, as above, so below. That isn't to say that the below is identical in transmission as the above. It simply means that what is above is manifest below, and vice versa. In the Neoplatonic schema, in Neoplatonic metaphysics, whatever is above can only be known below, because we are below. We are in this world. And so the perennial unfolds in the particular. And I'm one of the great stupidities among many, one of the great stupidities of modernity, is that it's not that that we can only know the above through our encounter with the below, but rather that we can simply ascend to what we believe the above is and conform the below to it, which is the epistemic structure of every ideological experiment in history, the consequence of which in the 20th century has been mass murder and destruction and so forth. Whereas the Neoplatonist recognises that it's through the organic unfolding down the ages, through history, of the above that we get to know the above. We know it through the unfolding of the below. The perennial and the eternal is only known through the historical drama, right? And so when you encounter the particularities of this island, you are encountering the perennial, the eternal, but you're encountering it in its historically contained embodiment or its incarnate being, and that is what it is to discover that you're part of a people, a nation, a territory, and so forth. It is an encounter with the eternal in the particular of this or that, and that's what makes it lovable. And I think that's what we have to try and bring alive again.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with your conclusion. I slightly. It's probably not the place of this podcast to pass elements of sort of rising above to the intelligible world to bring it down. It's not at least obvious to me that the problem was the attempt to do that rather than the type of person and the mode of doing it. But I think that that's a slight aside. I think what we have in English spirituality very early on is the most fertile ground for a truly particular form of Christianity. And I don't think every land necessarily has the same degree of fertility. I think we have an extraordinary abundance of riches. And I wonder whether it's to do with the fact that we're in the far west. I haven't quite figured out what the perennial meaning of that might be, but the East and the West have important meanings, both in the wisdom traditions and in the Bible, and we are essentially in the very far West until the New World was discovered. this was what was meant when people spoke of the West. Now, what is it about the Western divine feminine that is particularly potent? I think, well, there is no obvious and easy answer to that, but that is the object of the meditation that Western Christians need to undertake, because it has eschatological significance. The East and the West, the rising and the setting of the sun, that there's something extremely important there to be pulled out.
Yeah, I don't know, but obviously I think that it's not just where it's geographically situated, but it's its own internal history. The fact that this is the strange crossroads of the world, where these tribes were, and then the empire that was initially, as John Henry Newman called it, the Great Antichrist, that eventually became the Holy Roman Empire because it was baptized. It was all present here. Then you have the Anglo-Saxons coming. Initially, these great barbarians who wipe out the Romano-British church, only to then give us the great Alfred the Great, and then this further transformation through its Norman history. That as Edmund Campion was going to be executed in the 16th century, he cried out, "What has happened to this island of saints?" It became famous throughout the whole of the Christian world for its piety and its holiness. It's a very mysterious, weird place.
It's interesting that it would be from this island, to follow your thoughts, that the most obvious examples of Antichrist came out as well. Particularly if you look at the Reformation, it wasn't the Lutherans that created a worldwide empire with a sort of pseudo-Catholic church. It was the Anglos that almost were able to do what the Catholic Church had been called to do, and plant Anglican churches all over the world with their associated Masonic lodges, with the dark upturning of the king above the church, all of these issues that were vital in cultivating the Enlightenment.
Liberalism and utilitarianism.
Exactly, it all emerges from here too.
It all comes here, and I think that comes down to the well-known principle that the corruption of the best becomes the worst, that's why Lucifer, the light bearer, the greatest angel of the heavenly realms, becomes the most diabolical and evil of the demons, right? Because the corruption of the best becomes the worst, and the infidelity, the infidelity of England to the Arimathean mystery has meant that England has become in many respects, the great corrupter and the great tormentor of the rest of the world. But that, I think, is a discussion for another podcast.